as well as other projects that develop as a result of the economic development structure. I want to say a special thank you to Empower LA and the department for helping us put this together. They did very extensive outreach, issuing thousands of emails and communicating to as many people as possible about it today. So we have a very brief PowerPoint presentation. I'll go ahead and start and present it. If we're on the first one now. I can't see it, so. So as you may have seen, the council, as a result of the dissolution of the CRA, directed our two offices to begin the process of looking at alternative models for economic development. And they directed us to look at models based on the best practices that exist throughout the country. To ensure that that analysis was an independent one, we did ask for an independent consultant who has experience in economic development throughout the country to engage in this work. And the directive that we gave them was to, again, bring back best practices and identify ways that the city could engage in more effective economic development in the future. It's important to clarify that our goal is not to recreate the CRA. The governor of the state dissolved the CRA, unfortunately, and the powers that existed with the CRA, many of which were killed in the same process. It was really as an opportunity to look at economic development in a much broader sense. So part of that included the establishment of a department with the goal of not necessarily adding new responsibilities or certainly more costs, but trying to consolidate all the ways that the city is engaged in economic development, and as well as creating a potential partner through an economic development nonprofit corporation. The other thing was to ensure that we did an extensive review of all the efforts in the past on economic development, and this is, I'm relatively new to the city, but Jerry can certainly tell you about the many efforts there's been dating back to the early 90s and earlier than that to try to put together a cohesive economic development strategy in the city. Next slide. So what you have is, in terms of an economic development program, is a citywide strategic planning and policy development structure. There are two main pieces to that in terms of how we define economic development. The first is really looking at the city's assets. The city owns property all over our city, and sometimes that property isn't used for the most effective purpose. Sometimes it unfortunately is blighting the community and is not taking advantage of the economic revitalizations taking place. Because we don't have the same powers that the CRA did, we do have assets, and we thought that one way of defining economic development is being more effective in utilizing those assets for potential developments and projects that provides jobs to the community and various amenities that may not exist. The second is to develop a strategic plan around particular businesses and industries that the city should be more competitive and ensure that we're being responsive to specific services, not just in terms of actual developments of various parcels. Also being responsive to small businesses, ensure that there's an eye towards developing the workforce responsive to the business improvement districts and tying them to a larger economic development strategy. And of course, responding to having a much broader strategy around tourism. Now, in their assessment, our consultants sort of gave an overall view of how well, or what are some of the strengths and weaknesses that currently exist in the city around economic development. And one thing that they indicated is that we have strong fundamentals as a city. We're the second largest city in the country. We have a very diverse economy. We're not reliant on one specific industry like other cities. You see it in our revenues that we get. It's a fairly diverse. Our property values are strong and growing. institutions of higher learning in the region that help develop the workforce. And so the institution itself is important. And the other thing that they identify, that there's generally widespread consensus that there's a need for an overall economic development strategy that produces specific outcomes. They interviewed dozens of people, both externally and internally, to get an honest assessment of how well we do things and, frankly, how well we don't do those things. We also talked about the need to have a citywide focus. The CRA, the benefit of the CRA is that it brought a concentrated focus on specific areas. What we think is necessary is that there's still, while that's still important, that we focus on specific neighborhoods. Yes, Jack, thank you, I appreciate it. Although it's coming from Jack, so I should probably be careful before I take it. Thank you. That it also look at the city as a region, and that was one of the things that, because the CRA had specific geographic focus, that we didn't necessarily do as well. The other area was to look at the gaps that the dissolution of the CRA did in fact create, and identify how we could take the best practices of that experience and continue to move forward on an economic development in specific neighborhoods, in specific areas, particularly underserved communities in the city. And then the final observation is that there's a fragmented apparatus that is reactive sometimes innately in terms of how we respond to economic development. So if, for example, when, in the discussion around the stadium in downtown and how it ties to the convention center, the city is good at responding, bringing focus to that, putting together all the resources to make that happen, but is not as good as duplicating that model on a much larger scale throughout the region. The next slide talks about, so what kind of structure does this potentially look like? And again, it's important to emphasize that this report and this phase that we're in is about structure and systems. It's not about specific outcomes. So what you don't see in the report is an analysis that the city should be, ahead on biotech or go after this specific industry or create so many jobs. We're putting together as a structure. And so there were three main recommendations. One is that the role of the deputy mayor for economic development be strengthened. Second, and you see that in the top box, second, that there be an establishment of an economic development department that consolidates a number of different economic development activities within one department. Our goal is not to bring in new general fund dollars to that department, but rather move those dollars that are currently being spent for that area. And then the other is to look at partnering with an economic development corporation that's independent from the city and run as a nonprofit that would do a lot of the asset management, a lot of the strategic planning, and actually work on specific deals, and Jerry will talk more about that. And then the other piece is moving other functions like the contract with FIMLA into the economic development department for oversight. I have one more slide. The next thing is drilling down a little bit on the department itself. Again, the focus is to provide services and support to the city's businesses, to provide, oversee the contract with the Economic Development Nonprofit, or the CEDN, to work with that strategic, have a strategic relationship with that nonprofit to actually develop a citywide economic development strategy, and then serve as a clearinghouse for the city's distribution of federal and state resources for economic development. There's a number of resources that the city receives that could be consolidated to make them more cohesive and responsive to one another, but also much more accessible to the community. But with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Miguel. Excuse me. Again, I'd like to reiterate, as Miguel indicated, we're at the stage now where we're talking about broad structuring issues on how economic development is going to be administered. Our staffs have received a number of questions over the last several days, and much of those relate to what we're going to be getting into in the next phase, and that's one of the reasons we want to have this meeting now, is to give you a sense of the timing. A lot of those questions are going to be covered with a strategic plan that's going to have to be developed and brought before the council and the mayor for approval with your input. The actual contract with the nonprofit, that's how everything is going to get administered. That's how we're going to figure out, what businesses are we going to go after? How are they going to serve the local communities? How are we going to deal with blight issues and those sorts of things? Those are going to come back in the strategic plan and the contract. We also in the back have a question and answer sheet that you can take with you that may be helpful also with explaining a little more detail about what we have. So the proposal on the nonprofit is on the next slide. One of the main things that we are asking them to do is manage the city's real estate assets. Again, we own property all over the city, some of which is not being used. And many of you know in your communities, you might have a transportation yard, and a street services yard, and a sanitation yard, and a street lighting yard, and an DEP yard, etc. Well, maybe the city strategically can use its property better and consolidate some of that, and use some of that property to create jobs in the local community, create light industry, do many of the things that we should be doing with our assets now. We are not talking about asset management of the building we're in. Our General Services Department does a terrific job of housing city staff, figuring out where we need to be, how much space we need. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how the city can use the property that it owns out there to create jobs and create economic activity. We also are looking to the nonprofit to manage the city's off-budget finance entities. Your eyes can glaze over on this, but we have several of those. We have something called the Los Angeles Development Fund, which Miguel and I sit on. That's for investment of new market tax credits, which is federal funding. We also have the Industrial Development Authority, which is currently housed in the Community Development Department. They issue bonds for development projects within qualified areas, and again, that's government funding. We're also looking at advancing major economic development and public-private real estate projects. Now, these are some of the financing tools that we use right now are spread all over the city. What we're looking for is an entity that can figure out how all of these pieces fit together to be more efficient, to make sure that we're getting the most leverage that we can get out of the money that we are putting into the transaction. Provide expert analysis and negotiate transactions. Again, figuring out how all of the pieces fit together. As Miguel said, we react to projects, and we've been very successful, big and small, in many areas of the city, not just the huge, Staples projects, but Cornwall Plaza and District Square and a number throughout the city. But what we're looking for is something that can go out and make those happen, not simply respond to something that we're seeing. Go out there and find the opportunities for those, and then figure out how all of these pieces fit together. And then conducting city-specific economic research and analysis. Now, I will say with this slide that most everything we're talking about here is going, if this involves any city assets, whether it's city property, whether it's Section 108 funding, whether it's community development block grant or site-specific tax revenue rebates, all of those come back through the city processes. Nothing is going to change there. Reports will have to be sent forward to the council and to the mayor and through the committees. And again, with outreach to the neighborhood councils, you will have exactly the same input on that. That is not changing. All that's changing is the entity that's trying to put those pieces together and bring them forward for review. So in essence, in a nutshell, that's what we're looking at the nonprofit to take care of. And then the implementation schedule is the next slide. I will tell you that I think this is very, very aggressive, but I do think that it's important, we both think it's very important to try and move this forward. We do have a big hole that has been created because of the loss of the CRA. That tax increment money is not coming back. So every day that goes by that we don't have an entity out there that can try and create jobs and try and remove blight in many of our communities is an opportunity that we're losing. So we need to move deliberately, but we also need to move quickly. Now, again, in all of these areas in here, there will be public discussion, reports to the city council and to the mayor, committee meetings, et cetera. So this is the schedule that we're looking at going forward to try and implement this. And the last slide is just some conclusions. Again, what we're trying to do is look to other models that our consultants have told us are much better than we are. New York, Chicago, Austin, Cincinnati. There are models out there that are really successful in getting out there and bringing jobs and bringing economic development into the communities. So that, I think, ends our presentation, and now I guess we're open for questions.
We do have forms out if people want to fill those out. They're being collected now, so we could do this in an orderly way. That would be helpful.
Raise our hand.
No, well, I think there were some initial folks that you wanted to.
So, Clark, Mary Glenn, and Clark.
Great. So good evening. I guess our concern really stems from the lack of public engagement for this point. I know that in the consultant's report, they indicated that they had notified the neighborhood councils. I said on my neighborhood council, I went to done, and none of us could find any evidence of anything ever having come out to us. And even with that deadline, even with that, we assume it did. It was an 8-day, comment period, which just doesn't support and allow for the kind of engagement of neighborhood councils I think is so important here, because we're talking about a lot of city services, particularly when you look at, not only are you trying to form this economic development on, but then you're talking about consolidation of 2 departments. And so I guess my question is, one, what's the big rush? And why is this happening so quickly without the public overview and input? And then secondly, what type of public review process do you anticipate? Should you go forward and have this new nonprofit really sort of, I assume, managing the land as well as the dollars? Where is the community oversight and transparency?
So, in terms of the first one, there's 2 issues that are sort of driving the time frame, and we recognize that it is being done in sort of record time, particularly for us. The first is that we are in the middle of a budget process, and should there be a new department, that new department needs to be reflected in the budget. The budget, as you know, gets released on April 20th, and whichever functions are going to be in that department have to be determined prior to the release of the budget. And so that is part of the reason that's taking place. We heard the concern raised when this issue was discussed before council, and it's part of the reason why we're having this discussion tonight. We also know that this is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of the conversation, and there's going to be multiple points in time, particularly around the budget process, where there'll be opportunities to weigh in. The other issue is that, frankly, nothing is more pressing to us right now than the state of our local economy. We know that the economy is slowly getting better, but frankly, it's growing at a rate that none of us are satisfied with. And it's reflected in our revenues, it's reflected in our unprecedented unemployment rate. And with the dissolution of the CRA, there really isn't an alternative structure right now of any sort that is engaging in economic development. So the mayor, I know, and certainly in my conversations with the council president, do express a sense of urgency of creating something quickly so that we could get back into the business of developing an economic development strategy and engaging in specific projects.
And then in terms of the second part of your question, again, all of those issues you talked about, whether it's city assets, city land, whether it's city resources, all of that is going to come back through the council as it does today. So there'll be all of the opportunities that are there today in terms of committees, in terms of council. We certainly will work with done an outreach to the neighborhood councils to give you notice when things are out there. But the nonprofit won't have the authority to make decisions on any of those issues. The nonprofit would be simply putting it all together to bring forward to the council in a more efficient manner. So the opportunity for input on those issues going forward.
I guess I'm thinking a little bit more broadly about public review besides the city council. And I'm not sure I buy the budget argument because, as you say, this is the mayor's budget. The budget doesn't get passed for a while, so I still don't get the rush why we couldn't have had greater public lead up to this. But we had caps and pacts under, for better or for worse, we had caps and pacts under the CRA model. So there was an opportunity as projects came forward for communities to review this, to make sure it was consistent with those CRA plans. What is to ensure us that we're not going to just have wholesale development without proper community review and processes in place. And so I think we're losing a lot here, particularly when you take it to effectively the private sector to define what economic development looks like. I think that neighborhood councils, I think neighborhoods are in a better position to provide input on that on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And I'm just very concerned that we're losing part of the infrastructure. I don't hear you planning for the cap and pack process, right, in this new system. And so that's my concern.
That issue is going to be dealt with in the contract, as I said earlier. We fully expect that the contract with the nonprofit is going to require them to set up the equivalent of caps and packs or whatever for community input on the economic development proposals. Again, right now we're talking about broad structuring issues, but when we get down to the contract, which we will send forward, which again will have public input, one of the elements is going to have to involve community involvement as developments are moving forward.
Hi, I'm Elisa Newhouse-Smith, the independent keeper of the microphone. And I have a quick question to piggyback on that one. Would you consider implementing a specific neighborhood council vehicle for communication and feedback with this department?
Can you be more specific? I'm not sure what.
That you put into words or type some specific timeline and engagement process with the neighborhood councils themselves.
Yes, we'll put something forward when we release our next, we're releasing a status report probably within the next couple of weeks. And yeah, we can include in that the specific points at which there'll be outreach to the neighborhood councils.
Cool. Thank you. So, and if people have questions, I have a list of people who have questions. I was going to go Mary first. So, and please introduce yourself and then ask a question.
Mary Garcia, I'm president of Midtown Neighborhood Council. I think this is incredible. The potential here is tremendous. If the community is invited, if we're all sitting at the table, I see a great future. I see that we have lots all over the city that are sitting there growing weeds when they could be growing food, when they could be growing food for the community, and also those lots could be leased to people that want to sell organic food to the restaurants nearby, etc. Those are lost opportunities. Those are city properties, so I hope to see that. Let's see. I got here a little late, so I didn't have a chance to. Oh, timelines. Getting back to the timeline with your consultant or whoever, the nonprofit, I'd like to know who they are, what their credentials are, what they've done, so that we can see where they're coming from, because they may have a different slant on, where they've been, and we're a completely different city to any other city we're so well. So I'd like to see that, and also I'd like to see a timeline put into any project throughout the city. CRA was in my community for 34 years, and I think that's way too long. I think that you have to put a timeline on anything you do, because by the time some things were corrected or fixed or got better, those children that grew up there in not a very nice place left when it was still not a very nice place. So I think that's really essential in the future.
Thank you, Mary. And if you have a question, just raise your hand.
So to answer your first question, so the nonprofit itself, we don't know. I mean, what the city will be doing is issuing sort of an RFP process to encourage a nonprofit to respond, and the specific criteria and the expectation of the city will be laid out in the RFP and will be part of the report that we'll be issuing in a few weeks, so that and that will be discussed in public and both in committee as well as in the full council, and then ultimately the decision to move forward with that partnership would also be discussed in public, and there'll be a back and forth. The relationship will be accountable through a contract, and so that contract would establish what the expectations are, everything from the time frame as you establish, how they engage in the work, the relationship with the community, the specific objectives that we're seeking for them to achieve, and by when. All of that would be determined in the actual contract. It's different. The city didn't have a contractual relationship with the CRA in the same way. And so that's one of the benefits of doing it through a nonprofit, and it's what we've seen be successful in other parts of the country.
Yeah, Len Schaefer, Tarzana Neighborhood Council. I'd like to amplify a little bit of Mark's comment. Actually, this started back in 2007 with a motion from Greg Smith, and from what I can see was sort of hijacked in June of last year for this EDD. So it's actually been around since June. It's been heard by an ad hoc committee, which doesn't have to comply with the Brown Act. So nobody really knew what was going on. And that's very, very much of a concern to many of us. That's why we were kind of let down in the process. But some questions. One you answered. I was curious after reading both of your joint reports and your addendum, how this CEDN was going to come about, but you are going to do it apparently by RFP. I am concerned, perhaps you could answer a couple of questions. You're talking about initially something on the order of $32.5 million, $27-point-some million for this new EDD. I don't know how much for the deputy mayor, $2 million in seed money for the nonprofit, which apparently would be borrowed from one fund and hopefully repaid if we have excess of city bed taxes and things like that, and not spent until you have some type of matching funds. So I'd like you to explain with regards to the funding on that. The other that disturbs me very much. One question. Huh?
Yeah, let them answer.
Okay, one question at a time.
Certainly. Well, the $27 million that you're referring to, largely what we're doing with the Economic Development Department itself is moving functions around that already exist in a whole bunch of different places. The mayor's office, my office, Miguel's office, CDD, they're spread all over the city. So that's not new money. That's money that's already being spent. The $5 million seed money that's being discussed for the Nonprofit Economic Development Corporation would come from additional property tax revenue that we will be receiving because the CRA went away. One of the things that did happen is when the CRA went away, all of that money now gets dispersed. It's going to be very clear, and it's going to be clear with the RFP in our next report, that we view that as startup money, that over time, we not only expect the nonprofit to pay for itself, but to generate money back to the city. So the only new money in this would be the $5 million from new property tax we're receiving. The rest is already being spent.
Your own consultant talks about the fact that this nonprofit will be free of political restraints and bureaucratic restraints that the city now operates under. And your report talks about a strategic planning by this nonprofit with regards to assets and such. Where is it that the neighborhood councils are going to have access to all of this strategic planning and these things if this organization is not even subject to the PRA?
The department itself is responsible for preparing the strategic plan. We do expect the nonprofit to help in preparing that plan, but it's the department that's going to have to prepare and the department will have to send it forward to the council and the mayor for public hearing, and it will be adopted. And that will be the guiding principle under which the department and the nonprofit operate.
Next. Pointing fingers at each other. Tony Buckley. Introduce yourself.
I'm Tony Buckley with South Park. I'm intrigued that you used the word blight, so I put my attention. How does this new entity or these new entities propose to handle findings and or declarations of blight?
Well, to be clear, the findings and declarations of blight, I think, unless I'm mistaken, you're referring to what the CRA had to go through in order to capture the property tax increment. Again, that model is gone. The state got rid of that. So there will be more flexibility. It's really going to be up to, with input from the public, the mayor and the council to determine how we're going to determine blight. It's not subject to, the CRA. It's not subject to somebody suing us because they don't think it's blighted or not. There'll be more flexibility because we no longer operate under the legal constraints of the CRA in terms of determining blight.
I mean, one of the important things to point out here is that the opportunity that creates is that while the CRA was effective in the specific neighborhoods that had CRA areas, the rest of the city often didn't get any real economic attention. So because we're not constrained by that definition or the rules that the CRA established, then the city can engage in a broader look at economic development.
Okay, I have a question in my hand from Romuald Nalo. Do you mind if I read that first question?
I'd like to ask a different question because some of it was answered.
Actually, I was just thinking that one of them piggybacks on Lynn, so can I just read the first one for you? Okay. What role will neighborhood councils have in developing the strategic plan?
Well, as Jerry indicated, I think in the next report we will issue, it will talk about all the specific places in which neighborhood councils could add input, not just in relation to the strategic plan, but also on the development of specific projects. And so we imagine the strategic plan really being a collaborative process that involves the entire community. It's not going to be something that's going to be done overnight. There should be a mechanism on a regular basis to seek input from the neighborhood councils, but as well as other interest groups in the community who have a lot to contribute when it comes to putting that together.
And also, to be clear, the strategic plan is not on the schedule. There is no way that we expect a strategic plan is going to be in place by the end of the fiscal year. What we need to do is get the entities in place that are going to help develop the strategic plan. So that is a much longer timeline than what we've been talking about in terms of setting up the department itself.
That's right.
I'm aware that the CAO was doing an asset management review, and I would expect that that would inform the contract. What's the time frame between those two, and will you be making the contract before that assessment is done? And if so, how will you amend the contract?
Thank you for the question. They're entirely different functions. So the council and the mayor assigned the strategic planning of asset management to the CAO's office just several weeks ago. And that is to really look at, the 95% of all the other structures and buildings that we have to ensure that they're properly developed. Through that process, we may be able to identify potential parcels that could be developed for economic development, but that the city has a responsibility to maintain its assets, to examine the best use of those assets, regardless of whether they're intended for economic development, and that's really what that function is about. And it's entirely separate from the specific discussion about converting assets into opportunities for economic development.
Okay, thank you. I know Jack had his hand up before we were even here in the room.
My name is Jack Hunterville. I'm with Great Wilshire Neighborhood seems to me that one of the key elements here is the nonprofit and the ability to attract people that really know what they're doing, making investment decisions, being able to analyze. That takes a lot of skill. That's not something that we saw in the CRA, where it was more of a political body. Where do we hope to find, the talent that can properly analyze, negotiate, do deals that will benefit the city, especially given the city's rather unfriendly business attitude?
Well, this is a portion that seems to really work well in other cities, where in Austin and in New York and other parts of the country, when they have an independent economic development corporation that has a contractual relationship with their governments, they have the flexibility in ways that sometimes we don't to attract individual specific skill sets, as well as to attract a board of business leaders and civic leaders to help provide input and direction to that nonprofit. So by releasing the RFP, our hope is that the civic community, the business community, the larger community will come together and sort of organically create an entity and provide a response. We're keeping it, frankly, an arm's distance away from that process, in part because the mayor and the council leadership is very committed to making that entirely independent, precisely for a lot of the reasons you just stated.
Are there going to be caps in compensation? Because people in the investment industry tend to make a little bit more than city employees do.
That is an issue that we are discussing. The fact of the matter is that although it's going to be independent and we do want the best and the brightest, it's also going to be working with the city to further city economic development functions. So that's one of the things we're grappling with now, and certainly that will come probably in the next 4 or 5 months before that ultimate decision is made, but we are looking at that.
Thank you.
Lark?
You said that the new city community development corporation will be able to generate revenue to make itself, to pay back essentially the $5 million startup and be self-sustaining. Could you explain how they generate income, and is there a concern of potential conflict of interest? Now I hear you saying all the holdings, the city's holdings will remain with the city. So I'm trying to understand, how do they generate money in this deal? And does that, in fact, is there a concern about conflict of interest?
In answer to your second question first, yes, there is a concern, and that's one of the issues that is going to have to be worked through in terms of the contract and when a board is proposed to us and what the board looks like. In terms of the revenues that they should generate based on other models, again, part of what we're talking about here is the fact that we do not manage our assets well. And we've been talking for many years about hiring a firm like Jones Lang LaSalle or C.D. Richard Ellis or someone else to do our property management for us. We would pay them a fee to do that. They're private firms. The concept would be that the nonprofit would receive a fee for managing our assets and use that to fund its operations, as well as plugging back into making economic development transactions work. Also, whether it's CRA or any other entity, they would take administrative fees off the transaction fees, essentially, and putting these things together. So the nonprofit would be out creating transactions, and they would receive a fee for those transactions, and that would be how they would fund their operations as well. So those would be the two main sources of revenue. I will tell you, in New York, they started out with about $5 million a year as startup funding. They are now not only supporting themselves, I believe the last figure I saw is they're giving $150 million back to the city of New York. And again, they've been in operation for 25 years. It'll take a while to get there. So.
That was going to be my quick question while I walked across the aisle, with what other cities are you looking to that have done this recruitment?
That was a very important thing to the council leadership and to the mayors, that we try to take the best practices that exist around the country. And if you look at our report, and one of the attachments actually has a summary of 10 major cities around the country, and exactly how their structures are created, what have been the outcomes that they produced. And we basically took a hybrid of a number of them. The asset management piece works very effectively in New York City in terms of also developing sort of very large macro goals. In San Diego, it's very specific to the downtown area, the Gaslamp district. In Austin, they focused in downtown as well. So we took bits and pieces. In Chicago, it really is this broad sector of the business and civic community. So we tried to take the best of everybody as we develop it here.
John Wilkinson from Panorama City, and also chair the Department of Water and Power Neighborhood Council MOU Committee. And forgive me if this was answered before I came in. Everything I see talks about all city properties. And I'm concerned that if the strategic plan comes later, but the entities are set up first, we're basically setting up a situation where that's a pretty broad statement, all city properties. And I'm envisioning maybe the parking garage is revisited. I'm revisiting an interim general manager for the Department of Water and Power. Once suggested, well, why don't we sell and lease back the Department of Water and Power's signature headquarters building? Is this another way, I'm really worried about the signature properties we've got and the unintended consequences that could come about from something that is written as if it's for economic development, but it could be used for entirely other purposes.
No, that is not the case. 99% of city assets will continue to be city assets, and we're not going to convert City Hall into a hotel or to a shopping mall. The goal here is really to identify parcels that, in fact, we're not managing well and are creating blight in the community, or that, for example, are really underutilized. A good example of that may be some of our yards that we have. We have different departments that each have their own yards. Some of them may be in the heart of a community that's engaged in renaissance and wanting to, there may be a better use for that particular parcel. And so there may be efficiencies found in consolidating some of the yards in terms of staffing and management, freeing up some of those parcels. So it's really about being strategic in identifying these very specific properties, but by far the majority of them will continue to be operated and for city purposes.
Like we have 15 minutes left. So
Rosalie?
Well, should we try people who haven't asked a question? She hasn't asked a question.
Rosalie Preston, Harbor Gateway North Neighborhood Council. Did I understand you correctly that the RFP is going to be prepared within the next 3 weeks? And it seems to me that the RFP is like a really critical part of this whole proposal, and that needs a much longer time for careful consideration, hearings, and a lot of community input, because that's going to be the kind of the governing document.
Well, a draft will be out in the next 3 weeks. Now, whether or not that changes the input based on the draft being out, that's really going to be up to really the city council and the process through which it will be heard. So we're not going to be releasing an RFP in the next 3 weeks. What we want to do is put forth what an RFP is going to look like so that the discussion can begin about how we're going to attract the kinds of expertise on the nonprofit, I think, that was asked about earlier. That's what we're trying to get to now. So no, an RFP will not be out in 3 weeks. A draft will be released for discussion.
Do you foresee the nonprofit or the economic development department ever having eminent domain powers?
That is a huge issue. Do I foresee that? Quite frankly, there is absolutely zero possibility at the state right now for eminent domain. So I think it would be a very long time. I know that it's a very it's a very awesome and frightening power to have. I will say I've also worked on some projects that were really vital to a neighborhood, and there was an absentee property owner that simply had no interest in wanting to participate. So if it's used correctly, and it must be used correctly, it can be a great benefit. But the reality is, politically at the state level, it is not going to happen in the near future.
Hi, I'm Cindy Claycorn from Salentahunga, and my question has to do with priorities, because you talk a lot about the city-owned properties that exist now, that this would be utilized for primarily, it sounds like, as well as, repurposing yards and things like that. But for us in communities where we see commercial properties not being utilized, being left by their owners, we in the communities want to see improvement over time. And how will this assist and help, and how can we move up the priorities? At the same time, we're pressured with other development that might come in that might not be overall suitable for the community, because we're missing or not encouraging the economic development where those folks will need those services, such as restaurants, commercial, socks and underwear stores, things like that. And we're just packing in, say, affordable housing instead. And so we want to have a balance and not rush and have bad planning and bad development. So how will that, I know it's maybe a little complex, but how can we get involved in that?
Well, first of all, to be clear, the nonprofit will have no land use authority whatsoever. The planning processes are going to stay the same. And I also want to make it clear that we've been talking a lot about city property or city resources. The concept is that this is not just about using city resources to encourage business. What we're also looking for is an entity out there that can put people coming out of Caltech or USC or UCLA with brilliant ideas together with somebody who knows how to create a business, together with somebody else who knows how to raise money for that business. So it's not simply about the narrow focus of using city assets for economic development. The hope would be that it would be a very effective entity that would do exactly what you're talking about. You've got businesses coming in, and there's this area you're talking about that's underutilized and has great potential. So they put them together, and the city may not even be involved in that.
I think one thing that I heard from Cindy's question was, how do we support the businesses that are already here?
That's going to be part of what the Economic Development Department is really going to focus on in terms of strengthening the role of our small businesses, in particular, ensuring that they have access to all the federal grants and state grants that exist, trying to coordinate our permitting processes and being an advocate for that along the way. We have economic development functions scattered all over the city, and we believe that if they're concentrated in one department, then it brings better cohesion. Also, in response to your question, I think it's important to also state that the point of entry for a lot of private community priorities is going to remain the same. Working with your respective council members, they're going to continue to be advocates for specific projects and developments, areas of focus in your specific community. That will stay the same as it is now, and they, involve our respective offices. They'll work directly with the department and also with the nonprofit.
Thank you. You just answered her question. So I have a question here from someone. I would like to have clarity on the role of the EDD and the housing department. How does it fit into this new proposed structure? Will these departments merge into the new EDD?
No, I think the current discussion is to continue to have two separate departments. That's frankly the work that's being done now. There's some functions that may be more appropriate in housing, some of them that should be in the economic development department that work, but I haven't heard anybody talk about merging the two at all.
Tony Robles again. You mentioned, Mr. Santana, about property taxes will go up, and so there will be more property taxes available. available. I'm concerned here because, of course, one of the controversies of the CRA model was tax increment financing. And the whole idea of not having that is that the city, in its dire general fund situation, gets more property tax. To what extent is this model going to basically do tax increment financing stolen from the city's general fund?
As I said, this is not about tax increment financing, and this is not about banking on property tax growth. What we're talking about for the seed funding is property tax that's already being generated that had previously gone to the CRA, and now since the CRA no longer exists, a portion of that will come to the city. So we're not talking about trying to siphon off property tax growth to finance projects. The startup money is already money that's being generated and will come to the city.
You're taking it from the general fund.
We are taking it from the general fund. There is no question that this is an investment of general fund money in economic development. But again, we feel, and I can tell you my 15 bosses feel very strongly, that we must figure this out. We have to find a way of creating an economic development structure that's going to work and that may take some general fund investment at least early on.
I mean, the majority of the dollars that became available to the city as a result of the dissolution of the CRA, by majority I mean like 95% of it, went back to provide services to the community. It's frankly what helped us reduce cuts in this fiscal year and what's going to help strengthen the city in the future. So the outcome, whether you agree with it or not, is actually that it's strengthened the overall general fund, as you pointed out, and it's provided police and fire and other basic services.
My bad, it's CDD. That doesn't make it. Is the CDD going to be morphed into, or is it going to remain?
No.
So I have 2 more questions here, and then 1 more question in my hand, and then we're running out of time, so people should write down their questions so we can answer them next time.
This is Jack Overhill, Chair of the DWP Advocacy Committee. This is my DWP question. In the presentation, it talked about DWP making a development grant to the nonprofit. I think DWP is already doing its fair share with regards to supporting the city to the tune of about $750 million a year. My advice was keep your hands off of it. Thank you.
There's no question.
Right.
Before the CRA was dissolved, there were 97 projects, I believe, that were waiting in the wings to go through. I don't know how many of those have been done. Are they going to resuscitate those projects, or are you guys talking about creating new projects? And then there's a second part to that. At that time, too, they also had a steering committee program that allowed mayors and council members and community stakeholders to be a part of the process and a resource on these projects.
Okay, well, in terms of the existing projects, I will tell you that separate and apart from this discussion is the whole discussion of all of the assets of the former CRA that's now under the designated local authority. To be quite blunt, we are fighting with the state and will continue to fight with the state because the state needs the money. It's, in essence, the State Department of Finance has told virtually every redevelopment area in the entire state, no, we're not recognizing your project. Now, at the end of the day, if they're enforceable obligations, they are going to have to. But the reality right now is that they're simply saying, for the time being, they're not moving forward. So in terms of resuscitating the projects, quite frankly, a lot of that is out of our hands at this point because the DLA is a separate body that reports to the state of California. But we are going to do everything we can to preserve those projects and reinstitute the projects. And if they are reinstituted, they are going to proceed as they proceeded previously with the advisory committees.
Okay, so the steering committees would then be, I had signed up to be on and went through a whole interview process to be on the steering committee, so would they go back and reactivate those?
I'm sorry,
Will you go back on? I mean, it's so much of it is frankly out of our control. I mean, the reality is, I think it's going to be very tough for not just the city of Los Angeles, but every city to take back those projects. The state has been relying on that revenue. They've been consistent with everybody. It's not just about us. And it's going to perhaps result in litigation. The city's looking at all its options. It's going to take several months, a few years actually, before all of this gets untangled. It's one of the difficult things that was done as a result of how the CRA were dissolved. It didn't give any real opportunity to think those issues out.
Okay, I have a question from Robin Lyons.
I'm a new member of the neighborhood council, and my question is, how can we get this information? Will it be posted to a website? And is there any hard copies to take home to review ourselves?
There's hard copies of the presentation, I believe, in the back. And the question and answer that sort of asks and tries to answer sort of some of the most common questions that we hear, and we'll make sure to update it and include many of the questions that you just outlined. I believe that our report is on council files, so if you go to the city's website, you'll be able to find it there. So all of this information is public. Yes.
So ladies and gentlemen, it's 30 seconds before 8 o'clock, and we've had a great meeting. And if you'd like to see the PowerPoint, it's online in a couple of places, and it'll also be in the newsletter that comes out from PowerLI on Friday. The video from tonight will also be online and then in the newsletter. And the council file, which is like 100 pages of documents, is part of the package, and then the consultant's report. So let's give a big round of applause.
The ad hoc board of city council, they have that date, the next date, will this will be heard?
Do you know when this comes before the city council or the ad hoc committee?
We're potentially somewhere around the week of the 25th for the next report, but we don't have a date yet.
And if you could keep us posted on the dates, we can disseminate that information, and maybe we can get off to a better start date. Thank you very much.
Thank you.